Hi, and welcome to Connect Safely Live. I'm your host, Larry Magid. Our usual co-host, Carrie Gallagher, can't be with us today, but we have all the way from London, Sonia Livingstone, and all the way, I think, from Oakland, California, across the bay for me, Alicia Blum-Ross. And Sonia and Alicia are co-authors of a brand new book, whose cover is not in front of me at the moment, so I'm going to have them tell you about it. There we go, Parenting for a Digital Future. And I have read much of it and am extremely impressed. It is a lovely book, worth reading, even if you're not in depth interested in the nuts and bolts of internet safety, but just kind of as a ethnographic and sociological look of how families are dealing not just with internet safety, but in the broader context of wealth inequality. And they talk to wealthy and not so wealthy and very low income families, and just kind of the fact that what we learned from this book is that contrary to what you may see in many internet safety messaging, all families are not alike. There is a great deal of differences in opinions, in approach to parenting, in the kinds of struggles they deal with, yet there are some similarities that we all struggle with. So with that, I will introduce again, Alicia and Sonia, and start by asking sort of a general summary of what you reported in the book.
So maybe I'll kick off because as you imply, Larry, I've had a long-standing interest actually in children's internet safety, and this book does kind of come from there, but it really tries to do something much kind of more in terms of the big picture. Because what we were just saying before we began, and what I've often noticed, is how often parents are kind of spoken for as meant to be doing all these different things about their children's technology use or their children's online risks. A lot of organizations want parents to be acting in certain ways, but they don't always talk to the parents, and they don't always hear the parents' perspectives. And so when Alicia and I began talking to parents about what the internet meant for them or why it was important in their family, we really kind of opened up the whole kind of agenda, because there were so many different things parents wanted to tell us about. And as we put in the subtitle to our book, you know, the hopes and fears that parents invest in the internet, in the technology for their children, just goes way beyond questions of, you know, learning or safety. And we really wanted to kind of capture that and represent parents' voice and tell some of their stories in the book.
Now, I understand you spoke with 73 families in London, and you also interviewed another 2,000 or so, again, in the UK. But even though the research was done in London, I know that Sonia and both of you have done a great deal of research around the world. And as reading it from an American perspective, I was able to identify, not necessarily with the families, but identify these are not unlike families that I know in the United States.
I think one of the great pleasures of doing research in London is that it's such a cross section of humanity living in London. You have, you know, houses even on the same street that may be multi-million pound houses, and then you have houses that are social housing and low-income housing, which is subsidized by the state. So even in a relatively sort of small geographic area, you get this huge diversity. You get families who've migrated from all over the world and who are really trying to figure out how to stay connected with their family, you know, either in other parts of the country or around the world, who are trying to use media to, you know, help their children learn languages so they can communicate with grandparents, you know, who are all around the world. I think we had families from Eritrea, Portugal, Brazil, the US, all over Europe, beyond. So I think that was one real great strength of doing the research in London, is getting that diversity. I think one, you know, thing that we've learned in subsequent projects with when we've done some kind of comparative research with colleagues who worked in the US, and obviously I'm an American parent who was living and raising my children in London at the time of doing the research and is now in the US. There's a lot that is in common with what we heard from parents in the UK, but a couple points that were sort of interestingly different. One thing that we hear in the US, for example, or that colleagues identified in the US, was sometimes US parents may be more likely to use framing around property rights. So for example, this is my phone, I bought it, and therefore I have the right to look at my kid's phone because, you know, I'm the one that pays for it, or may use kind of metaphors like from law enforcement, like if the kid gives me probable cause, I'm going to search their phone, you know, that kind of framing. That's actually our colleague Nathan Fisk identified that in his book, which we didn't really hear from parents in the UK quite so frequently, and a little bit more emphasis perhaps on children's privacy and children's kind of right to expression and freedom. That is a slight difference, but I think interestingly notable.
And that's prominent throughout Europe as a much more sense of children's privacy than it is in the US. By the way, I was so excited to get started with you guys. I forgot to introduce you in terms of your bios. I'm not going to read your entire bios because that would take the full hour. But Alicia Blum-Ross, who we just heard from, the one with the American accent, is a researcher, educator, and advocate who has worked in academia, industry, and civil society to study and create opportunities for children, youth, and families to more safely connect, create, and learn. She has a PhD in anthropology, and full disclosure, she works for Google currently, and we work with her in her capacity at Google, and happy to do so. Sonia Livingstone, who's a friend who I've known for years, is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science, published 20 books, including The Class, Living and Learning in the Digital Age, and her PhD is in social psychology. You know, at the start of your book, and either one of you can address this question, you talk about how some parents were consumed about online parenting issues and others were not so interested. It wasn't as big a deal with them. I'm kind of curious the difference, you know, why some are and some aren't, and whether it really mattered in the outcome in terms of how they wound up protecting or interacting with their kids.
So maybe I'll start off. I think there's kind of good reasons and bad reasons why some of the parents weren't so concerned. So maybe to kind of start with, not the bad reasons, but like the problems. What became very obvious to us talking to parents, you know, we began by asking about technology, but their whole lives would kind of come out, and we would discover all the other challenges that they were facing over and above, you know, is my child the right age to have a phone, or should they be going on this or that website? And lots of parents were just consumed with some really genuine and often even heartbreaking kind of problems that they have to contend with. And so for some, the technology is not such a big deal as those of us in the kind of the world of children's internet use and internet safety might think. They had a lot of other stuff to worry about: money, about family breakdown, about their special educational needs of their children, and so on. So we do in the book pursue the way in which technology kind of gets bound up in those problems and often becomes the kind of focal point where families feel they can exert some control in what might be quite kind of challenging lives. And then just, you know, by contrast, there were other families who, it's not that they weren't concerned about the technology, but they'd kind of come to terms with it. They kind of found the place for it in their lives. And they weren't so anxious, but they had a story to offer about how, for them, given their particular circumstances, their particular values, the technology kind of has its place, and they found a way, and it could be very different places. You know, some families would like embrace the technology and they'd go all out and they'd be geeks and they'd say, you know, the geeks will inherit the earth and that's where we're going, and we're happy with it because we understand what we can do with it. And others would have a much more kind of, you know, reserved, kind of balanced, sometimes resistant approach. But they had worked out how it could kind of fit with the values that were important to them. So if they were like artistic creative types, they would have found a way that their kid could play kind of artistic creative games, and there would be a synergy, and it wouldn't feel jarring. It wouldn't feel like the technology is contradicting what they're trying to do in their family lives.
Yeah, I have to confess, I used to be one of those geeks, optimistic parents, and
Not surprised.
not so much today. I mean, I am, but I'm also tempered by some realities.
Oh.
And speaking of realities, although the book was published just a matter of weeks ago, I assume it was written and certainly researched before the pandemic. And in the book, you talked a lot about the way families live together, and I'm wondering if you any thoughts about how the pandemic may have changed the dynamics of families, at least temporarily, as they are literally stuck together in many cases.
I think that one of the kind of key messages in the book, of course, is that parents are actually making all kinds of discerning judgments about quality of how their kids spend their time, whether it's quality of the actual media that they're consuming, or whether it's that it feels like it was a good interaction, that, you know, the kid was connecting with somebody who the parent felt good about them connecting with. And that actually gets very obscured by the rhetoric of screen time, which is really about minutes on the clock. And actually, in the survey, we asked parents to kind of rank, or like to say what causes conflict between you and your children, and things like bedtime and behavior, of course, were like top of that list. But I think 3 or 4 was screen time, but way down the list was what they do when they go online. So it was really kind of very counterintuitive. They were much more focused on time and rather than what. And I think that the context of the pandemic, in a way, has really highlighted that, you know, the importance of the context in which kids are using media, the content that they're engaging with, what they're getting out of it, what it's bringing to them, what it's limiting them from, because so much of kids' lives are online right now, whether it's school, whether it's their whole peer interactions and relationships. And I think it's also kind of flipped that sense of risk a little bit as well. Like, you know, there is a very real sense of risk, and not just sense, but actual risk of going outside of the house and being together in person. And so I think a lot of parents now are kind of, you know, judging online interaction to be relatively less risky than, you know, a invisible virus that is, you know, taken over the world. But they still are kind of navigating through, given that childhood is so digital at the moment, how can we still try to mitigate those risks, even given the current circumstances?
You know, when I started working in the online safety field, starting safekids.com, which was a predecessor to Connect Safely, it was during the 90s. And at that point, parents were not digital natives. I mean, parents were like me, grew up with, you know, typewriters and old-fashioned telephones, and we didn't have computers as children. But that's not true anymore of young parents. Anybody in their 30s, even 40s or younger, clearly grew up with technology. They probably had AOL or some kind of modem-driven experience when they were kids. And I'm curious, you know, what that means, you know, when you talk to today's parents compared to my generation of parents, whether we're getting, and I don't know how far back your research goes, but what you're seeing in terms of the parents who themselves are digital natives.
Actually, Larry, since you asked, I began researching how families are engaging with, quote, new media in the mid-1980s,
Wow.
when new media meant, do they have a video recorder? And the big dilemma was, where do you put the home PC? When you finally manage to get a PC, where on earth do you put it? And does it take up the dining table? And, you know, there were all these, and oh yes, and do you allow your children to have a television in the bedroom? That was another.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Yeah,
the kind of the equivalent then of when can they get their first mobile phone and so on. So yes, parents have been on a really huge learning journey in the last few decades, and each generation of parents knows more, of course. I think it became really apparent to us that it's less like inappropriate and indeed a bit demeaning to think of parents still as those digital immigrants who don't know stuff. As you say, today's parents are growing up with all kinds of technology. So even when we ask parents to kind of look back at their childhood, which was a feature of our interviews with them, to kind of look back at their childhood and then forward to when their children would be grown up. You know, there is technology there then, but it's still less than it is for their children today. So there's still a kind of disjunction between their childhood and their children's childhood. But as you say, parents are kind of better equipped to cope with that. And one of the kind of sad things we found in a way was how little schools or even kind of, you know, service providers kind of speak to the thoughtful, knowing, sometimes digitally skilled parent, and kind of draws on what it is that they could really bring to bear in their parenting. And we very much wanted to get over the message, not that all parents know everything, but the parents are learning. They know a lot more than they used to, and they would like to kind of contribute that knowledge to the way that they parent, um, in relation to technology and through technology, because technology is a way that, especially during the pandemic, the children are learning about everything and connecting about everything, and parents can really play a role in that.
One of the things I loved about your book, we talked about digital immigrants, but you spoke to people who were geographic immigrants who came
Right.
to London from all parts of the world, some with very deep religious convictions. You talked about some of the Muslim parents you interviewed that would get up very early to do their prayers. And it brings up a lot of questions in my mind about what it is like coming to a city like London, having your kids have access to broadband when you're coming at it from both a national and potentially religious point of view, which may create a little bit of dissonance between your beliefs and what you've experienced and what your kids are experiencing online. I mean, you can have very strong borders around yourself, and by borders I mean social values and whatever, but when kids get online, they are more than likely to be exposed to a much broader set of values and experiences than you typically are. And I'm just curious, what's that like for those families?
I mean, in some sense, I think a lot of families talked about the opposite, which is that because there was such a spectrum of different experiences that could be had online, they could find the particular experience and even like app, that corresponded to their particular values, or in this case, religious faith. Like we interviewed one Jehovah's Witness identified family who were using, there's like these different apps and like interactive games on like jw.org that they, that's what their kids would play with, right? Or I think you referred to, like, one of the families was a very religious Muslim family who had kind of guideus.tv, which is this kind of site, where different families can send in, videos of their children reciting verses of the Quran. And it's this great, moment when you see yourself featured on this channel. So it was, it certainly emphasized to us the fact that like families were finding their way through a very dispersed media environment to the particular sources that actually felt consistent with their values. That being said, some of these families also identified, as you say, kind of moments of cognitive dissonance where, for example, in the family that I just mentioned, they had this very elaborate security system sort of set up in their house where essentially they had a screen in their living room which was hooked up to the children's TV in the bedroom. And so the screen would show what the kids were looking at in their bedroom, like on the kind of living room TV, essentially. So that was their kind of surveillance tool and there was like this kind of wire, coming, like sort of cables coming down the stairs, plugged into the TV monitor in the living room. And so that was, certainly they were like particularly concerned around things like nudity or swearing and, things that they felt were kind of counter to their religious tradition. And they had actually a very difficult experience when the daughter had gone to a friend's house and, had a sleepover, and apparently the parents of the friend were watching what they described as pornographic content. I'm not sure whether that would, be an accurate description or not, but certainly, the family that I was interviewing then had to go pick up the daughter at the friend's house, and et cetera. So I think it highlights also that, I think I'm sure you talk about a lot with families, whatever rules and, agreements that you have in your own home, your children are social beings in the world. And so I think a lot of families were struggling to figure out how to instill those values in a way that the child then could take forward into their own life and their own experience.
But in a lot of families, and again, I don't know how this coexists with your research, there are, I don't know, differences between a parent's values, in terms of sexuality, sexual orientation. They may have a very strong feeling about a sexual orientation. They may have a very strong feeling about religion. And it's not uncommon for the children to vary from that, to kind of go off in their own direction. That's kind of what children are all about to some extent. And I'm just wondering, especially in the age of the internet, where it is so easy for a child, and even politically, I mean, you know, in America, you can be a Democrat, your kids can be a Republican, you can be somebody who believes very much in racial equality, your kids could get into some of these hate groups. And I've heard stories about that. And I'm wondering if you encountered any of that in your research and how families were coping with that.
I think we should say that primarily we were kind of focusing from the parents' perspective, though we interviewed as many of the children that we could, but we didn't. This wasn't a project where we kind of, as it were, got into the child's, you know, other life. But what we know from research, and we reviewed a lot of the available research to do this work, is that when parents, when there is that kind of disjuncture, and especially when parents become kind of restrictive, or they want to surveil what their children are doing, then children might, you know, if they've got a different perspective, or they've developed a different interest, there will be a breakdown in communication, and the children will, as you said, kind of go off and find other spaces, other ways to pursue their interests. And so wasn't our kind of place in the research to make judgments about what the parents' views were or what the children's views were. We really kind of wanted to capture the diversity of family experience. But what we can say from the research that people have done is that if there is that breakdown in communication, you know, things just start getting worse and worse. And so the more parents and children, parents especially, can not take a punitive approach, or not take a kind of jump to judgment or jump to punishment, then the better it is that the family will, the parent and child will come to at least some kind of mutual understanding. And maybe this is one of those areas, I mean, British parents worry about this absolutely as much as American parents. But perhaps they're a little more fatalistic, because they kind of recognize that the child, especially an adolescent, might kind of go off in these directions, and might be able to, they might go off and kind of get beyond their control, as it were. And there are just things that's just very hard for parents to deal with. So parents often, they're a little fatalistic about the what their children do on technology, because they don't make that claim that I think is more common in the US, that they kind of have the right to investigate and monitor. And apart from the case that Alicia described, you know, there's always exceptions that prove the rule.
I'm not sure it's fatalistic or realistic. You know, one of the things I liked about your book, I thought you did a really good job in terms of balancing not being judgmental, yet at the same time being somewhat prescriptive. I mean, you guys have values and you didn't hide them, but at the same time, you didn't judge people. And speaking of that, you talk about the democratic family. And I'm not sure what the other term would be, authoritarian or whatever the opposite of democratic family is, but that's a debate that has always consumed communities of parents that talk amongst themselves. And you know, in my family, I think the family that I raised, my children, my wife and I think we're, you know, somewhat democratic. We didn't have put everything up to a vote, but the kids certainly were heard and even involved in important decisions. Like when we moved, we got our kids to kind of agree in general to where we were going to move to. They didn't get to pick the house we couldn't afford, but anyway, but talk about that democratic versus whatever the other term is, families, and kind of what you learned by comparing those types of families.
I mean, I think one thing that was really illuminating is when we asked parents to look back to their own childhoods, some parents were very nostalgic, and they remembered this childhood of kind of like freedom, where you were, you know, farmed out of the house and come back, you know, kind of when it's dark. And there was a lot of kind of rosy, like maybe rose tinted glasses, perhaps nostalgia around this kind of life before digital media and screens, or, you know, kind of when, as we discussed earlier, parents were just, you know, like kids were just starting to, you know, have AOL for like 45 minutes a day. I mean, it wasn't AOL in Britain, but whereas a lot of parents actually also reflected on feeling very isolated from their own parents, feeling like their own parents hadn't listened to them, you know, that they'd had perhaps a father that, you know, they didn't see, or that, you know, that kind of more kind of top-down model of family, right? Where children should sort of be seen and not heard. And so they were kind of actively trying to live out a different kind of model with their children. And this is not necessarily just, middle-class parents. I mean, I think we heard this a lot, families, for example, immigrant families, who are sort of seeing the opportunities and chance to explore for their children in London. They can try lots of things. They can be who they want to be. They can have lots of opportunities that I didn't have, that kind of thing. So I think there was a lot of interest in parents in what you could maybe call in the sort of Californian way of self-actualization, that kind of helping their children figure out who their children wanted to be. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of precedent and model for that. And so what ends up happening is that parents also were trying to use digital media both kind of within that project, help explore, express yourself, maybe write something, maybe create something. But they also were sort of leaning on digital media as the only kind of authoritarian tool they had left. So if you don't do X, you're going to lose the Xbox, or, if you do X or Y, your reward is going to be this new game or more screen time or whatever. So it was we're sort of at this interesting inflection point right now where a lot of families are trying to kind of live out these more egalitarian values, but it's still really hard. And digital media are so sort of attractive for children that actually parents do still lean on them, both as reward and as punishment, for other kinds of actions, that their children may take. So it certainly wasn't, I don't think, an easy path for parents to navigate, but we did see that the families that did take these more restrictive measures, I think I mentioned the surveillance earlier, another family that would lock the iPads up in the safe. And then the children confessed to me separately that they would break the iPads out of the safe,
I was very
in the middle of
impressed
the
that
night.
they could break into the
Yeah,
safe.
and safe crackers. So I don't think that we saw, and certainly the research that Sonia mentioned bears out, that very top-down kind of restrictive model doesn't necessarily yield a lot of success if the overall aim is to help your child kind of express themselves and grow and get access to these
You're
opportunities.
anticipating my next question, but before that, I want to just experiment. I grew up at a time we had no seatbelts, we had no bike helmets, we had no cell phones. So when I got on my bike at 9 o'clock Sunday morning and came back after dark, my parents had no clue where I was. And as far as I know, they were less anxious, at least exhibited less anxiety than my generation of parents did when I think we were guilty of bubble wrapping and helicopter parenting. So there might be some happy medium between what I experienced and what kids are experiencing today. But you kind of anticipated my next question. I was going to ask if you could talk about the benefits and drawbacks of what you call policing children's digital activities, because that's a big debate going on right now as to, should we install a parental control app on our kid's phone? And if so, should we install it on our teens' phones as well, or just our little kids' phones? How much privacy should we give them? How much control? Is the world going to come to an end if we find out that, or we don't find out that they might have looked at porn? Where do we make those how do we balance all that?
Well, that was a lot of questions, Larry.
I know.
And the questions that I've spent my career trying to worry about and figure out the answers to. So I don't think I can answer all of that. But I would start by saying, you said what are the pros and cons of policing? And I would say there are no pros of policing. I mean, what we really want to say is policing is the wrong metaphor for parenting. And if parents are the police, what do the police do? They abide by rules that come from on high. They distribute sanctions. They deal with criminals. It's just a bizarre model for parenting and a really weird way to position children. So when we heard that kind of talk about policing, we heard it sometimes from parents, but it's there all around them. And one of the things, that someone in your position can do, and, the many people who are kind of advising parents, is really find a way to, not that this is your chosen discourse, but really kind of help parents find that kind of more democratic, more kind of discourse that respects what children might want and what they're trying to do, but children have very little power in life, so they'll be naughty, or they'll be crazy, or if they see a rule, they'll break it because there's not that much they can do. You know, we adults, we hold a lot of the, so we really try to find ways of thinking of different kinds of metaphors, as you already said, in relation to a more kind of egalitarian, a more trusting relation. And actually, I would say that's what most parents want to do. They kind of start out wanting to build that trusting relation, and they want to be the person their child will come to if they have a problem. But when things start to go wrong, and when everyone gets anxious, and when people don't kind of feel supported or quite know what to do, then the tensions begin, and then people kind of reach for those policing metaphors, or that sense that they have to kind of clamp down and control. So, you know, thinking of so we wanted to kind of make a plea really for space for a different kind of parenting and support for those parents, rather than because what we often see is a kind of judging of parents, and parents talked a lot about how they felt judged, like they weren't demonstrating being in control of their child enough. And you know, if we see a parent and child in the street and the child is using a phone, we all kind of tut and say, you know, they're a bad parent, they're not controlling. So we call on parents to control when that's, you know, we don't know anything about their lives, we don't know enough about the context that lead parents to act in the ways. But still, you know, this is not to say we're advocating parenting without limits and without boundaries and without, you know, kind of rules. It's just that the policing metaphor is wrong, because sure, we don't want the kids, you know, there's a lot of stuff online that they shouldn't be seeing. There's a lot of stuff that they can do online, or risks that they can come up against that they can't address, they can't deal with by themselves. But, you know, really focusing on the relation between the parent and the child. If the parent is the police, when the child does come up against a problem or a difficulty or a risk, they're not going to go to the parent. They're going to fear, because they'll fear the judgment, and the device will be taken away. So if we really want to deal with the risks our children might face, we need democratic ways of finding boundaries, of agreeing on rules. And then we need a trusting relation, so when there's a problem, they'll come to us.
So if I can break with protocol in terms of having you guys alternate, because Alicia has a lot of great things to say, but this is a question really I'm going to address to you, Sonia, because of the fact you've been at this for a very long time. Anecdotally, and because I'm not a researcher and I don't know what the data show, but anecdotally, when I look at my kids' generation, my kids are in their mid-30s, and when I look at their friends and when I look at people around me, young people around me, I don't see generations that have gone to hell. I don't see
Right.
also, I don't see increased sexual violence. I don't see increased crime. I actually see a generation which is better than my generation that grew up without the technology. But that's just anecdotally. From your experience, having done research over now periods of decades, what are you finding that, you know, the kids that grew up in the digital age, you know, who maybe now young adults or even, you know, 30-year-olds, what do you see of these young adults in terms of?
Right. Well, it's a great question, Larry, and I would say there is a kind of research consensus out there among the sociologists and psychologists who look at those long-term trends, and those long-term trends for what goes wrong with children. And pretty much all the trends are, as you say, they're in a positive direction. So, of course, we have to make value judgments here, but children are, over the decades, there's less problems with alcohol, there's less problems with drugs, there's less early or underage sex, there's fewer teen pregnancies by and large. Of course, there's always variations, there's less crime. So sometimes you see the headlines that say, you know, what happened to being young? You know, these kids are all so good, so safe, so sensible. So the only counter to that I think we need to take really seriously is the idea that a lot of the anxieties and struggles about being young, instead of being expressed outwardly in breaking things and stealing things and doing bad things out there in the world, are kind of internalized. And so there's a lot of talk now about mental health difficulties, and you know, the sad thing about a mental health difficulty in a way is that the child becomes the sufferer, that they kind of internalize, and that's where they So that's where the struggles are. And we can argue the stats are not very strong there. So it's not very clear that mental health problems are increased compared with people feel more okay about talking about mental health difficulties, so they express it more. And again, back to that kind of public discourse, we are all being told we're living through a mental health crisis and, you know, encouraged to. So it's just very hard to say that things are worse in that regard, that they might be, but there is no real evidence that childhood has got worse. So yeah, I agree with you.
In fact, Instagram, actually, we did an interview with one of the Instagram people, and she was saying that they're actually encouraging people to share their mental health struggles because that helps them and obviously helps people who are reading about it, knowing that they're not the only ones that are dealing with situations like this.
Right. And we don't know what sorry, Alicia.
Oh, I was just going to add one thing, I think, to what you said, Sonia. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is, whilst there's a sort of general movement towards the positive for a lot of social indicators, as Sonia discussed, one thing that has sort of actually lessened is the sort of future financial prospects of a lot of families. So this generation, and certainly the pandemic has actually absolutely exacerbated this, is sort of like the first generation to be really forecast to be less prosperous than their own parents. And so I think that one of the things that a lot of young people and also parents of young people are facing is it's going to take longer for those children to, you know, to be independently able to, you know, buy or rent homes. The pathway to a kind of a stable career is much more attenuated. Even once you're in a career, you're more likely to move, you know, between sectors and between careers. So a lot of that kind of jobs for life and kind of, you know, stable, like adulting is not available to this generation in quite the same way. So I think that is one of the things that we also felt is that, you know, if parents have a greater sense of risk now, and there's a lot of work done on the kind of the risk society and the sense of risk that parents may like assume onto their own individual shoulders, actually a lot of that risk, again, it's not the kind of crime or teen pregnancy or things that may have been kind of heightened in past generations, but it is that sense of financial security. And unfortunately, that's a society-wide problem. That's not something that an individual parent, however they may try, is going to necessarily be able to fix for their children. And yet parents feel that keen sense of responsibility to kind of make the difference. And that's one of the reasons that we found also, especially low-income parents would spend like disproportionate amounts of their income buying, you know, tablets and, you know, other kinds of digital devices that they felt would give their children some sort of access to education, some kind of a leg up. And it was, you know, really noticeable that actually digital technology kind of, in some ways, many parents, and again, particularly low-income parents, were sort of turning to technology as the kind of answer to this like much more systemic form of disadvantage that they were facing.
Which is ironic because a lot of higher income parents are turning away from technology. I mean, we have the Waldorf schools, for example, which often are higher income families that advocate, you know, holding off on technology until the kids are a bit older. You know, it's interesting about this whole discussion about crime and, you know, teen pregnancy, et cetera. There's always, I think, a disparity between how people feel about risks and the actual risks. I mean, during periods, for example, when the crime rate goes down, a lot of people feel that the crime rate is going up. And you know, they're not looking at FBI statistics or whatever government agencies in their country, but what they are is somehow they're perceiving a danger, even though the data shows that it may not be there. Speaking about danger, you mentioned in your book that you said screen time, watching the clock when it comes to screen time is missing the point of parenting in the digital age. Yet it is something that a lot of parents are very concerned about. I think, Sonia, when we interviewed you a couple of months ago, you brought up the fact that screen time is kind of a major issue for people. So let's talk about that, because it's something I think a lot of parents struggle about, especially now during the pandemic, when their kids are on screens practically 24/7, because that's how they go to school and the only way they can hang out with their friends. How should we be thinking about screen time?
So one of the really interesting things that happened just before the pandemic, so kind of over the last year, was one key organization after another was kind of lining up to say, we kind of got screen time wrong. So the American Academy of Pediatrics has been, debating this again. In Britain, the Royal College of Pediatricians has debated it. There's kind of been a series of like big health inquiries that have said, actually, we can't really find the evidence that it's about time. And I just want to be kind of precise about that, because what the idea of time always conveyed is that 1 hour might be okay, the second hour is a bit less good, and the third hour is really disastrous, and you have to kind of, like, each hour would build up more of the problem. And we just don't see that in the evidence. So there is an argument to be had about obesity and the nation's kind of physical health and how much time, but screens are one reason why kids sit still, and there are many others, and a lot of the research says it's the other things that really make the difference. It's not having safe places to play, it's not parents not feeling the kid can cross the road by themselves, it's not being able to cycle like we used to. So it's what's happening with food and what's available in the shops that parents can afford and so on. So when you say, if we just look at the time children spend on the screen, we can't link it to problems in their lives. If we start at the other end and say, okay, what are the problems we think children might be facing, like a crisis in obesity is one, then we say, okay, screens might be a small part of the problem, but all these other things are much more important. And you kind of see that pattern of explanation in lots of areas. So in that context, it became really interesting to think about why parents are being told that screen time matters so much. And I think one answer is kind of the advice that they hear from their pediatrician or from their teacher or from the doctor, whoever, that advice doesn't get updated. So the fact that last year a lot of big organizations rethought doesn't necessarily filter through to parents. And then another reason that I think is really interesting is, we're talking about really complex problems that families are facing, and I completely understand why parents would kind of like there to be a silver bullet solution. They'd like to feel that if only they could kind of count the hours and count the number of minutes their child is online, that would solve the problem. But actually, as Alicia said earlier, what our survey showed is that just generates more conflict. What is screen time? Is screen time when you're Skyping your granny? Is screen time when you're doing your schoolwork? Is screen time when you're kind of, the TV's on in the room, but you're really distracted and painting your toenails? No one knows what screen time is anymore, because we do so many different things with screens at the same time as so many other activities. So parents actually, I think they're ready to hear a different message and move on from that one.
And of course, we can be engaged in technology without even using a screen, like Amazon Echoes and products like that.
Right.
I don't think in my, more than 25-year, 30-year career as a technology journalist and internet safety advocate, probably a week doesn't go by when I don't get pitched by some kind of new parental control app. And it goes back to Net Nanny in the 90s. And in the old days, they used to say, we block porn. And that was a big deal. And then they started talking about how we were going to help prevent cyberbullying. And now they typically talk about hate speech and screen time. What's your sense of these tools, when they're useful, when they're not, when we need to wean our children away from them? I just kind of get a feeling of, how you guys look at the whole issue of parental control software.
I'll take a stab at this, Sonia, but feel free to jump in. I mean, I think one of the families that we spoke with, we were in the middle of the interview, and the mom kind of called to the other room and said, "Do you have your self-control on?" And it was like, what are you talking about? And we ended up having this interesting conversation, because the school it was a one-to-one school where they had school-issued laptops, and they had all come pre-installed with this app called Selfcontrol, which is obviously in some ways a very ironic name.
Yes.
That would kind of filter out, certain sites could be used at certain times, or there was just kind of settings that you could adjust in terms of overall time, or directing attention, to the school portal, but not to, you know, other sites that, you know, parents might deem distracting or the school might deem distracting. And it was like, you know, was one of those kind of great examples where there's a real difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, right? Like, you know, has the child internalized a sense of self-regulation, or has the app given them the sense of self-regulation, right? And, you know, obviously, like, you know, I work at a company that offers some parental controls. And so I think that in some sense there's a place, you know, for tools, and there's so many different tools and options in the market right now. I think one of the things, however, that we saw from both the research, you know, the secondary research that we did, but also the parents that we interviewed, is kind of quote unquote control tools alone are never really going to solve the problems that parents think that they are. And certainly to the extent that children end up feeling kind of under surveillance or spied upon, or kind of not kind of given sort of a say in the rules that are set, they are more likely to try to circumvent those. And many children are very clever and probably will find ways to do so. So I think, you know, we kind of came away with a sort of a sense that parents were coming up with a range of different practices. We've talked about a few on this call, whether they were physical, you know, ways in which the home was set up, whether they were, you know, apps and tools that they had incorporated, but that essentially that like the sort of the parents that were finding the most kind of, I don't want to say success, but like that they felt most confident about the way that they had handled that, were basically engaging with a range of tools rather than necessarily relying on one. And by tools, I don't just mean actual apps and technological tools. I also mean tools like coming up with kind of family rules about like, hey, don't check your work email at the dinner table, and I won't check my social media, you know, and that they had kind of come to that kind of social resolution as well.
And some research has shown that a lot of kids are very concerned about their parents' use of technology in terms of, you know, using technology when they should be parenting. But I mean, in general, I guess one of the things that's always kind of puzzled me about, in fact, I find the title self-control to be a very, very ironic label for a parental control product, but how, whether we use the tools or don't use the tools, how, and I've said this going back to the 90s, how do we get the software that runs up in our heads, you know, between our ears, how do we get that tuned to protect ourselves? Because with any luck, our children aren't going to stay children forever, and they're going to be adults for a lot longer than their children, right? You get maybe of 18 years of childhood and hopefully another 50, 60, 70 years of adulthood. And how do we, as parents, make sure that these values are instilled in them? I mean, my kids are in their 30s. We never had controls, or actually for a short period of time, we had our kids on parental controls. But clearly, at this stage of the game, I'm just as worried about my kids today as I was when they were little. I'm very concerned about their well-being, but I have absolutely no control about what they do on the internet, where they go in their car, who they interact with, what they drink, what they smoke. You know, I've got to trust that they're making good judgments. And how do parental control tools or lack of same contribute towards a young adult and an older adult who's going to do the right things?
So again, it's a huge range of questions.
I know, sorry about that.
No, and I kind of, I mean, you kind of communicate the parents' kind of anxiety and sort of pain in a way of not being able to guarantee children's future and that things are going to be okay. I think that's what that's what we heard so much from parents when we asked them about, you know, how their child is going to grow up. You know, the children today are going to be grown-ups in 2030, 2040. None of us can imagine that, let alone begin to control, you know, how do we get there in a successful way. And one of the things I think parents have to somehow find a way to come to terms with is that they have to live with that uncertainty. And they just, you know, there isn't going to be a tool, there isn't going to be the magic app that solves the problem and kind of does parenting for them. And, you know, and maybe we just have to find ways of making some of that anxiety and uncertainty a bit productive. So if it could lead parents a little bit more often to ask their kids or kind of understand things from the perspective of their children, you know, that might bring a better kind of communication between them. But, you know, in terms of the big risks that parents are really worried about, I'm happy for parents to have all the tools in the world. You know, if tools help, great, but tools alone are just not going to cut it. And the tools are only going to work if the parent and child have that sufficient degree of trust and communication between them. Otherwise, the child will feel the tool is against them. They will find a workaround for it. They'll look for some other way of, they'll go to a friend's house and do whatever it is that they can't do at home. We just create a kind of an escalation of the problem and a kind of war, at home. So, let's come back to that idea of joint media engagement that, that is kind of advocated by folks at the Cooney Center and elsewhere. That, because we saw this in a lot of our families who were, they didn't think they had the magic solution and they didn't think they could overcome all of these problems, but they were looking, quite a number were looking for some point in the day or some point in the week when they could come together with their kid and find a positive moment. And it's intriguing how often that would also be around the technology, whether it's about a favorite TV program or kind of, and cuddling up on the sofa together to watch it, or whether it was about kind of getting up early in the morning and playing a favorite video game together before the rest of the family's up. They would find those moments when they're not only coming together, but they're coming together around the technology. And that's the moment when maybe the child can say, I saw this thing I shouldn't have done, or that's bugging me, or, that's the moment when, and parents can kind of take, it's good to take those opportunities. So I think we can't, we talked to a lot of parents, and some found some solutions that worked for them or for now. And others were going through lots of kind of crises that, one can't make it all better, but I think I could be sure that the technology is not going to make it all better all by itself.
We need to wrap up very quickly. Alicia, do you have any closing thoughts?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much, Larry, for the time. And it's really fun to talk about all these wonderful families that we spent time with.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did this research in this book. And by the book, it's called Parenting for a Digital Future. I see it's available in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle for as little as $10. So definitely worth buying and worth reading. Again, whether you're in the UK or the US or anywhere else in the world, these are stories that resonated with me, even though I've never lived in the UK or didn't raise children there, but they resonated because they're human stories. And I, again, very much appreciate Alicia and Sonia. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Larry. That was really great questions.
Thank you.